Hi everyone, I'm Ruthie Norden,
And I'm Janice Hyasnitzik.
and today we are talking about whether to add or delete a scene. And this was based off a question that we got recently about is it necessary to put sex into a book? And I would say that could apply to just about anything. Is it necessary to put violence in a book? Or maybe some kind of action sequence or anything really.
Exactly.
So we thought we'd broaden it to, what whether you add something or delete something
Right,
to
exactly.
your book. Did you want to start?
The only thing I could say as far as whether you should keep a scene or not keep a scene is it move the story forward? That's what you always have to think is it move the story forward? If the scene doesn't move the story, even if it's the best doggone words you've ever used, or you think that it's got such great interaction with characters, if it doesn't move the story and your plot forward, you delete it.
Right, and that's a good rule of thumb. Every scene has to have a purpose. Every dialogue that you put in there, every action, it all should be going towards the conflict. I would say if it advances the conflict, then that's good. So, like the main character in the story, you should have everything in there where they're either getting closer to what they want or maybe something's happening, which would be conflict to pull them further away from what they want.
Right.
So,
And in a romance, you want something that gets them a little closer because they got to have the romance, and then you got to have some kind of climax or something that's got to happen that either breaks them up and brings them back together or something along that. Yeah. But you got to have something that shows maybe an intimacy scene, and that would be a necessary scene. Their intimacy.
If not all romances need a sex scene. I would say the good rule of thumb for a sex scene in a romance is if you can show something in the character, either the hero or heroine, during the act that you cannot show anywhere else. And it's possible the hero or heroine might feel more vulnerable, or maybe they get scared because they are getting closer to the person, and then they're like, kind of freak out. So then they pull away a little bit.
Right.
After it, I mean, there's many ways you can kind of work around it.
Right, and an intimacy doesn't have to have sex. It can be just a nice scene with them kissing and hugging and all that kind of thing.
Right, intimacy. That's why I asked you specifically.
Because there's different kinds of intimacies.
Right. But if you could say, I would say if you could have the same story without sex in it, you don't put the sex in.
Right.
If the story is altered, and if it's not the same story, if you take the sex out, then you need the sex in there. And that's the same thing with violence. You don't have to have a gruesome, violent scene if it doesn't add to the plot. Right. Say you're doing like a thriller or horror. But even in romance, you could have like a violent scene. And I know that probably sounds weird, but let's say the heroine gets kidnapped by this villain and he's a really nasty guy. Well, how are you going to show he's a really nasty guy?
Right.
That would be if he were to be violent, like maybe he hits her or something. So that would be something that you could do.
Right, and maybe there's something that you want to show in the guy that she's supposedly supposed to be fall in love with that's bad.
Maybe his violent tendencies.
And then you realize, well, they're showing the character, and you're finally really made this guy this way over here might be the one that's really should be intended for her.
Right.
So you got to, that moves the story, but those all move the story forward.
Now let's say you're not writing romance. In other genres, it can work too. I think even in like science fiction, fantasy, thrillers, if your main characters are together, and I say if they have sex, there could still be a purpose for that. If it's showing something in the character and how the character evolves because of it, or even violence. I don't think some thrillers are psychological, so they're not really violent, but there's like a lot of suspense and a lot of like, oh, what's going to happen next? Not necessarily the gruesome, grisly thing. So just because, don't think, well, sex is only for romance or violence is only for horror or something. You can have them in all genres. It's just how you're using it.
Right, exactly. And one thing to avoid is description is really nice in a scene. You like to have a feel for the time period. You like to kind of maybe hear some noises and smells and your five senses. But if you overdo it, if you got a whole page of just description and it doesn't really go anywhere, take it out or at least bring it down to a paragraph because it's not moving the story forward. It's clogging down people's ability to read it, and their fact is they could say, oh my goodness, what's the purpose of this, and they might not even read anymore, and your whole thing for having your book is just gone because they don't finish it.
Right. And I read a romance years ago, and I remember this scene, and it was just like basically a chapter. And I'm not kidding. It was a chapter where all this woman was doing is cleaning the kitchen and cooking. The hero wasn't there. There wasn't even a kid. No one for her to interact with and build a relationship with. And that's what romance is supposed to be. It's supposed to be relationships and building that connection. And you can do that in many ways. Well, even if she's learned something about herself, well, she was already competent cooking and cleaning. Now I could see if she never did it before and she's like fumbling around trying to figure out what in the world to do. I could see that, but see, she already knew everything, so there was no reason for it. And I say something, the same thing could apply to dialogue. If you're going to have this lengthy conversation with a character and it's just kind of like, hey, how's the weather and nothing is advanced, or they're rehashing something that we've already been told before, or like this is, we're being told like maybe for the second, third time the same thing. And I think that's because authors are afraid that the reader is not going to kind of like get what's going on. But readers are smart; they're going to get it. And I think that sometimes if a reader has to think about stuff and really put the pieces together, I think it can actually enhance the story instead of being spoon-fed everything. I like a lot of the subtle things.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you're right. And too much repetition can get old. And
Right.
then when they start seeing that,
Like if you have a beta reader tell you, well, it kind of sagged in here, or yeah, I kind of already know this, or maybe it's better put somewhere else. And this is one of the things with backstory. People have a tendency to put all this backstory in the very beginning of the book.
Right.
Well, having that whole character's history in the beginning of the book isn't going to do any good because we don't care about the character yet. You've got to wait until you're further into the story when the reader has an emotional connection with the character. Then that reader is going to want to know that backstory, like why that character may be afraid of something, or
exactly.
be a certain way. You don't want to dump that all on them in the first chapter. That's boring.
Right, exactly. You got that backstory because it just pulls the story down, but don't feel bad if you have a tendency as a new writer to do that. That is a real common mistake.
Right, and I did it too.
And we've all done it, so you had to learn through experience. But it's better to take that character and then have them just bit by bit by bit. You're telling the backstory, but you're not doing all in the beginning. You're just doing a little bit in pieces.
Works.
Yeah.
If you do hints, it can really just move the pages.
Right, it can.
Because then people want to know. Like, let's say the hero's really standoffish, but there's like maybe a thought or two he has kind of like alluding to it. But the person's like, well, what in the world made the character this way?
Right, exactly.
That could be a very powerful element.
Yeah, and that keeps the reader moving, just something like that. If you give them bits and pieces where if you've told them everything, you've told them everything.
Right, and then there's nowhere else to go. There's even no matter what the genre, even in a romance or science fiction, you still want some suspense in there. And suspense doesn't just come from like being afraid or something. It comes from many things. It comes from questions.
And if a beta reader tells you you've got a hole here, that they want more information on something, you might look at that to add a scene.
That would be an add.
Because that way you're maybe they're feeling kind of left out. Maybe this would enhance a little bit and take their input and then kind of analyze it and have a couple other people look at that same spot and see what they think. And if they thought so, then add that, because sometimes just small things like having the character maybe take a cloak and wrap the woman around with it is just a nice addition to that maybe
towards the tenderness and
it just gives you more interaction and everything like that. So you just kind of look at that to when you need to add a scene too, because there are times that you do need to add or just embellish a certain place, certain things like that. So
and I think maybe a rule of thumb is if you're reading someone else's book, would this be interesting to you?
Right.
But it's hard to be that objective with your own stuff. And there are some things you fall in love with and you really want in there, but sometimes, and maybe you can save it for another story if you have to take it out. Maybe it can work somewhere else. And I've done scenes like that.
I have too. I just love this part, but it didn't add anything, and I had to take it out, and I don't want to cry. But it's a better story, but you can always save it, like you said, and think about that for a different place.
Right, and I've done that several times.
Yeah, I have too. So yeah.
And I think that's about
it.
But
it is.
And if anyone has any questions or stuff, this will be posted on the blog, so you can ask us.
Exactly.
On our blog, and I'll link to that in the YouTube video.
Sounds good.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you.